Well, thank you all for coming. It's a really great turnout. I want to say a word about the show first. So this conversation with Peter is in the context and in conjunction with this exhibition that's largely now been turned off for this show. We are sitting in the gallery space, so usually there would be a video here, there would be videos playing there. There's a piece back there in the corner, a record player with 3 sound pieces on records that you can listen to. We're going to try and clean up as quickly as possible after the talk and get the show back up. So if it piques your interest, stick around for a minute or two, and it's all headphone-based stuff. There's a virtual reality piece that happens right here, and I think that will help situate the talk a little better, although Peter certainly stands alone. So Peter, I'm going to give you a little introduction, although I know you have a lot of familiar faces in the crowd.
Sure.
So Peter is an independent journalist, and he specializes in conflict, security, human rights, and organized crime. His writing and photography, you're an excellent photographer too.
Oh, thank you.
And actually, so part of this is to have Peter weigh in as an expert on the subject of migration. And the other aspect is that Peter is a photographer, and you have created this project.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a creative process, so in a way, Peter's also a creator. And I'm interested in talking to him about what it took to funnel all of this reporting and all of these ideas and experiences into a final product that you can all read today. But anyway, his photography and reporting has appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal. I do have to look at the list, it's very long. Vice.
You don't have to read the whole thing.
I'm going to read the whole thing.
Okay.
Politico, World Politics Review, Christian Science Monitor, Al Jazeera, The Independent, The Telegraph, and a 5-part piece, really deep reporting, really excellent reading, just came out in Foreign Policy, the journal, and that's available online. That just came out last week, so I hope you'll check that out. On a personal note, Peter and I know each other already, and Peter was one of the many people who were sort of in my environment as the concept for this exhibition developed. The exhibition is called Fellow Travelers, and it looks at the question of migration, but not specifically the European migration crisis. I was particularly interested in the way that artists throughout history have actually turned to metaphors of outer space to deal with questions of displacement and migration on Earth. So we start with Sun Ra in the 1950s in the Great Migration, developing what would later become Afrofuturism, and ending here, we're sitting in the middle of Halil's piece here, which does deal directly with the European migration crisis from the perspective of a Turkish artist. So Peter, as I'm going around, I was living in Berlin, and in 2015, I moved there in 2014, and that was the height of the beginning of the current situation. And Peter passed through in 2015, I think Yeah, and I got a text at like midnight that Peter was in town, would you like to get a drink? And so I go meet him somewhere in Berlin, and he's on his way from Turkey. He's come from Turkey through the Balkans, ended in Berlin, on his way to where ultimately...
Berlin was the final stop.
Berlin was the end. It had been a long journey, and he was traveling the same route that many of the migrants that he was reporting on were traveling. And so in addition to all of these artists who were making work that I found very responsive, Peter was also there at the right time when I was thinking about this. So I'm pleased to have you here. And I think Peter will give us an introduction to the topic.
Sure.
And then we'll have a brief conversation, and then we'll open it up.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Catherine. And thanks to APEXR for having me. It's a real honor to be here, and it's so great to be here in New York City, where we never actually did kind of a formal book launch. So many familiar faces, friends from as far back as, well, in some cases, kindergarten, and all the way up to new friends that I've only recently made are here, and it's really a treat to be here and to be able to share this book and my experience reporting on it with everyone here. I think what we had discussed before is I might do a brief introduction just about, in some ways, the refugee crisis in general and what the book is about, so that we're all kind of operating on it with a common vocabulary and common understanding of what we're discussing. And then from there, we'll have a little bit of a discussion and open it up to Q&A, which I always look forward to, because that kind of helps me understand what people are most interested in, and often challenges me in ways that I find quite rewarding. So I look forward to questions when that time comes. Can everyone hear me? Is the mic okay? A little closer? Okay. So just to start, I mean, the book...
Should we angle our chairs?
Sure, yeah. Just let me know if it's okay. To start off, and let me know if I'm taking too long. I can talk about this for a long time.
There's a lot of material.
Okay, well, so the book, as it's called somewhat, in some ways controversially, is Migrant, Refugee, Smuggler, Saviour. And of course, when we think about this migration crisis, and I prefer the term crisis in quotes because this is something I'll get to later, but I actually don't think Europe has a migration crisis. I think Europe has a migration policy crisis, and that's something very different. But the way the book more or less came about is I had been reporting on the migration, again, crisis in a few different locations, and both as a freelancer but also as a researcher for an organization that I often work with called the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. And the reason they were interested in this crisis is because they wanted to better understand who are these smugglers, who are these organized networks of people that are facilitating really this unprecedented movement of people so suddenly, so effectively, so efficiently. So as I was kicking around some of these areas, northern Niger, Turkey, various parts of the Balkans, I kind of did a check-in with the woman who is the co-author of this book, Tuesday Retano, who's the co-founder of the Global Initiative. And I said to her, as a part of speech, like, yeah, there's a lot of really interesting stuff here, and you know, there's a book to be written about this. And I was using that as a turn of phrase, and she said, well, do you want to write a book about it? And I said, yeah, sure. Again, operating in a theoretical level.
And it went really fast because you said that when we met up in Berlin, you said the book wasn't in the works. It wasn't.
It had just been approved as like.
So that's lightning quick.
Yeah. So in a matter of weeks, in a matter of days, Tuesday had whipped up a book proposal and said, fill it in where you think necessary and let's send it. And then the publisher immediately was like, yes, we'll take it. Of course, we may have been we may have exaggerated how far along the writing process we were, really by indicating that we were anywhere along the writing process. But, and so yes, that is exactly the time when I was running into you in Berlin, and it had been days before that I had found out that the book had been accepted. So that's sort of how the book came about. In terms of just setting the scene for this crisis that we're all talking about, I think there's a few things that people need to understand in sort of how we got here. Mm-hmm. And the first is that we're living in a time really of unprecedented displacement. So there's about 60 million people worldwide who are displaced. That includes internally displaced persons, so people who are displaced by some sort of force, whether it's conflict, climate change, poverty, natural disaster, who have had to leave their homes. And that includes, again, internally displaced and people who have had to leave their country. Depending on the estimates you ask, you consult, there's about 20 million people worldwide who are displaced from their country. That's a lot of people. But within that context, a lot of these people have been displaced for a long time. In some cases, years. In other cases, generations. There are people being born in refugee camps right now who are third generation refugee camp. And we think about, some of the examples that come to mind, there's Somali refugees living in the Dadaab camp in Kenya who had been there indefinitely confined to this camp for decades. There's third generation Palestinians being born in camps in Lebanon and Jordan. There are Afghans who are in Pakistan for now generations. And so many of these people have been lingering away in refugee camps that really don't offer any opportunities in any really meaningful sense. Within that, and in addition to that, there are a sizable amount of displaced people who are living in the shadows. So there are people living, there are Syrians in Turkey, or Palestinians in Lebanon, or again, Somalis in Kenya who aren't living in camps, but they are living in the shadows, living in the margins without really official documentation, in ways that make them second-class citizens, that really they can't access what it means to be a citizen of these countries. And so again, they're kind of in this indefinite status. And they've been really let down by the international community because we afford these people rights on paper, and not everyone, many people have signed up to all these conventions that give these people rights, but we don't fund the mechanisms to give these people rights. Again, these camps are not good places to live. They're often insecure places to live. And so what we have in many ways is people voting with their feet. They're taking their fate into their own hands and saying, I'm not going to wait any longer. I've heard this promise before that things will get better or that someday I'll get to go back. And I'm just not going to wait. I'm going to find a way to get to where I think I can thrive, provide for my family, give my children educational opportunities. So that's going on one level. And these are the people when we say refugees, that's who we're thinking of, people who've been kind of forced away by some sort of greater force that is either conflict or natural disaster. Above that, the broader term would be then economic migrants, or just migrants in general. And these are people who are moving because, again, they think there might be some very structural global things that prevent them from having the opportunities that they would like in life, don't really see a legal avenue to achieving that. And so again, they're taking matters into their own hand. They're not going to wait for their highly corrupt government to sort things out. They're not going to wait for things that aren't going to get better anytime soon to sort themselves out. They're going to, again, vote with their feet. And that's a different community that maybe requires different policy tools, but with the refugees and how this intersects and comes into what has become this migrant crisis is that there's, in many ways, a giant paradox in the way we think about refugees and what we afford them according to international law. And the United Nations Human Rights Convention, the Refugee Convention that is from 1951 that most countries have signed on to, says that it defines what a refugee is and grants you the right to seek asylum. If you are a persecuted person, if you're fleeing war, you have a right to get to safety and seek asylum. And the countries who've signed up have agreed to grant these people asylum. In practice, though, what this means is every country, the US certainly fits in this category in some ways, but Europe has really pretty much defined, their policy has become the following, which is basically, you have a right to asylum if you can get here. Please don't come, and we're going to make it as hard as possible for you to get here. And practically speaking, so this is where migrant smuggling comes in, and where my co-author and I thought it was really important for people to understand this dynamic. We're living in a world of unprecedented demand to move somewhere safer or to move somewhere where you can achieve opportunity, and none of our legal infrastructure, none of our law, we're not living up to the legal rights that we've afforded these people. And so the only choice they have in order to seek asylum in many cases is to hire a smuggler to get them to safety. This applies to Syrians getting out of Syria in the first place, but it also applies when we think of Germany and the million asylum seekers they received in a very short amount of time who were granted asylum. I remember a representative from Europol, the European Police Agency, saying, well, we have found that over 99% of the refugees who came here hired a smuggler. And I said, well, of course. How else were they going to get there? And that's an important thing to think about when we think about smugglers in general. Smugglers are service providers. They're the supply to this unprecedented demand. And the ways in which they provide these services can range from very professional and courteous to incredibly exploitative and rapacious. So there's this broad spectrum upon which smugglers exist and operate. And then the actors that are involved often are quite diverse too. There's a spectrum of the low-level entrepreneur who sees an opportunity to make a buck helping people cross a very simple border, to the very sophisticated document forger who for $50,000 can get you a US passport. So that's the spectrum on which these people exist.
And those services, of course, also scale to and respond to the financial means that a would-be migrant has at their disposal.
Exactly.
Right.
And so,
and enter Syria, that's super interesting what happens, right, to that dynamic.
Right, and that is part of what we wanted to really delve into in this book, is help people understand why various migrant smuggling markets are shaped the way they are, and why people have to resort to certain means. Why is it that along this route, this type of migrant can actually move pretty safely and efficiently, where another route, it requires kidnap for ransom, sexual abuse, it's often highly exploitative. And to provide a more nuanced picture of who we're thinking about when we think of smugglers, and also what it means to target them, and why people target them, why governments target them. And as I think you just fed into right there with the Syrian case, the example of Syrian refugees, I think, is pretty instructive to understanding how these markets work and how they can change very quickly. And going back to 2011, when I've got a map here that highlights another migration route, but if we go to the very top where it says Tripoli and where the purple arrows all kind of converge on the Mediterranean Sea, Libya emerged in 2011, 2012 as a really principal gateway, 2013 especially, of irregular migrants and asylum seekers taking boats from the Libyan coast in order to reach Italy.
And irregular refers to people who are trying to penetrate a country illegally.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, so illegal, it's terminology, illegal migrants, irregular migrants, people who are trying to enter through not using a visa, right?
Yeah.
Not going through formal channels. And at the time, so that gateway had actually existed for much of the 90s, and there were tens of thousands African asylum seekers and economic migrants trying to reach Italy via that avenue. And then Italy decided, well, the only way to really be able to deal with this is we're going to have to cut a deal with Muammar Gaddafi. And Gaddafi, ever the extortionist, kind of knew that, well, in this kind of dynamic, he holds the cards, and actually said to gave the warning to Europe. He said, I could turn Europe black if I wanted to. And that's his quote, not mine. And he is clearly playing into the xenophobic anxiety that Europe is feeling as they're seeing boats full of African migrants arrive. So Europe cuts a deal with Gaddafi. The boats stop, aren't arriving in the same numbers. Of course, with the Libyan revolution, subsequent NATO intervention, Libya has fallen into chaos. There is no government, and it kind of became a wide open gateway. But what we saw, and I don't think people really anticipated this at the time, was that a revolution and a chaos in Libya, plus a political revolution and then war in Syria, would result in people from Bangladesh getting on boats from Tripoli to Italy. So there's kind of a convoluted constellation of things that happen here. And part of the reason that happened was because Syrians, unlike many of the asylum-seeking communities we've seen in the past, had a real purchasing power. This was a country that was upper middle class. A lot of the people who were on the move, trying to get to Europe, saying, I don't want to linger away in a Turkish refugee camp or a refugee camp in Lebanon indefinitely. I want to get to Europe and seek asylum. They took matters into their own hands, traveled to Libya, and paid smugglers to take them there. But because they actually had some considerable resources, they could demand that you put me on a boat that's actually going to get there. They could actually demand a modicum of consumer protection. And smugglers themselves said, well, yeah, Syrians are willing to pay a premium. This is a good market to be in. I want to be an upscale smuggler. I want to be moving the people who can really pay. So a lot of the smuggling infrastructure that exists right now through Libya that we're still seeing was built on Syrian demand for smuggler services. And I think that's something important to keep in mind. If at the time when Syria was first exploding, we had, of course this is not an easy thing to do, found a way to either end the war, find a solution to that conflict, or actually provide legal channels for Syrians to seek asylum in Europe, or devoted the resources necessary to make it so that a refugee camp isn't absolutely intolerable. Some of the very sophisticated networks that operate in Libya might not have gained so much professionalism, and that route might not have exploded.
Right, which continues to really matter because there's less of a demand from Syria now, right?
Right.
But these networks don't want to stop making money. And so what you outlined in the book was a pervasive situation in which smugglers are recruiting new migrants actively. And they have channels that stretch way deep into the Sahara, sub-Saharan Africa, and they're trying to drum up business. And if you can't pay what a Syrian can pay for a voyage, no problem. It's tailored to your buying power and your market. It'll come with 10 friends, you get a discount.
Right. Yeah, and so Syrians are no longer taking this route in really tangible numbers compared to other groups. I mean, there was a boat earlier this week that was rescued at sea and brought to Italy. It had 600 migrants on it. 50 were Syrian. But most Syrians, and this is, I guess, without going into chronology, after the Libyan route exploded, there was a new route that opened up and became preferred, and that was if we can maybe go to another map here, basically this route, which was, I guess, policymakers call the Eastern Mediterranean route. I prefer to just call the Aegean crossing because it's easier. But Syrians, many of whom were living in Turkey or had access to getting to Turkey quite easily, would just go through Turkey and then get on a boat that could take them to the Greek islands, which are in the darker shade of yellow, and that's a much shorter crossing. It's incredibly easy to do. If you're sitting on one of those islands, you can literally see the other. I mean, one could almost be tempted to try to swim it, and you can see the refugees, boarding the boat on the other side and watch them come over. And again, this touches upon how the nature of the crossing and the nature of the obstacle that your smuggler needs to overcome really shapes the market. Anyone who can purchase a dinghy and can round up 60 migrants can be a smuggler in this context. That's quite different from trying to overcome a very robust wall or heavily guarded border. And that's worth considering when we think about the policies that we might take towards either combating smugglers or, I would say I think many anti-smuggling policies are really anti-irregular migration policies, which has different implications. But anytime a border is made more restrictive or more difficult to overcome, that almost certainly just drives up the price of smuggling services and often pushes out some of the low-level criminal entrepreneurs, I would call them, and into the hands of often kind of more established organized crime networks who already have the criminal expertise to move people across this very restrictive border. Right. And that's where the supply and demand comes in. If you only try to combat migrant smuggling and make it harder to move, but you don't reduce any of the drivers of why smugglers are coveted, why they're necessary, then all you're really doing is making the routes more dangerous for the migrants and refugees themselves, but also driving up the prices that they have to pay in order to take these routes. So there's a very self-fulfilling prophecy that happens here in which the criminal networks, when a border goes up or a policy gets more restrictive, that's a bonanza for organized crime groups. They say, great, we're the only one. The market's being driven into our hands.
Yeah. And so I think for this, what I'd love to get out of the talk here today is that there is this mind-boggling situation that's developed very quickly. And it's super global, it's globally networked, it's incredibly complex. And if I can compare us for a moment, I think what Peter and I have both done, me in a tiny exhibition, Peter in a book, is try and lay out and open up some questions about the situation, but it in no way offers solutions. In a lot of ways, it's much too early to tell. It's been like 3 years. And one of the very provocative claims in your book, after reading a whole book filled with, and I'm going to read you just a few statistics pulled from the book, because they're alarming. It's a very anxiety-producing book. So, for example, 7% of Mali's GDP comes from migrants who have made it to Europe sending money back home. The impetus for Mali to crack down on illegal smuggling is zero. This is a driver of their, well, I won't say economic success, but it's their development. Another one, from 2013 to 2016, the number of migrants trying to penetrate Europe increased by 1,500%. And it's projected that in a few years, 800 million working-age people will be living in Africa by 2050. And trying to head towards Europe for more opportunity. And that's more than the entire population of Europe at the moment. Mm-hmm. So after going through the book and getting statistics like this, what I found so interesting and provocative and useful about the book is that you have to tamp down a knee-jerk emotional reaction, which is to say, those are super scary statistics. Oh my God, there's really a crisis. Mm-hmm. Because you need to have a complex and deeper understanding of what drives these crises. And the challenge is that the obvious thing, like, oh, well, let's send a warship to patrol the Mediterranean, it just makes it worse. Trying to keep people out doesn't work. They're coming, right. And they will keep coming. And your proposal is that possibly the best thing to do is wait and monitor, deeply understand the situation, understand that, it's not all the same everywhere. Mm-hmm. Maybe you can talk about that a little bit, that there might be different solutions necessary to different approaches. Mm-hmm. And basically to try and reduce human suffering, that can be a tangible goal. Instead of trying to reduce migration, we shouldn't be trying to reduce migration. Did I?
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. I guess the first would be, when discussing what policies to pursue, you probably need to make a bright line between asylum seekers and economic migrants. And despite the fact that the differences are so clearly outlined in international law and most domestic law, it's actually, that can often blur. But you can still make that line and maybe have some more coherent policies. I think, to start with your first point, with a country like Mali in West Africa, where entire communities are very heavily reliant on remittances being sent back, people getting to Europe and sending money back, the government really doesn't have many incentives to crack down on what, by all accounts, is a driver of development. That's a source country. A country like Niger, and if we can go back to the map before this, so this country, the one that is in the shade of, looks like pink from here, that is kind of in the middle of the map next to Mali, which is in green, that's Niger. And there's a kind of a main corridor you can see where the red and green align. That's in a town called Agadez that is the preeminent migrant smuggling hub of West Africa. Almost every West African who goes to Libya and then onward to Italy passes through this one town, which is really on the southern edge of the Sahara Desert. Now, Agadez has always functioned as a smuggling hub of stuff, whether it's goods, people, weapons, drugs, but the entire economy of this place is predicated on communities who live there, who have the requisite skills to move things across the Sahara Desert efficiently and effectively, and then also bring things back from Libya. And it's within the context of Niger, it's often been a place that is where there have been rebellions. It's been a source of frustration. Communities up there resent the government in the south, think that the government in the south is not representing their interests. And when the migrant smuggling boom happened, suddenly, and as someone who's been to like Agadez before and after, it's in some ways incomparable, right? When the boom kind of hit, there were operating ATMs in Agadez, something that didn't really happen all that often before. Entire economies sprouted up. It's not just the smugglers, it's the people, it's the hotel owners who are expanding so that they can house the migrants as they're waiting to find their smuggler. It's not just the car owners who rent cars to the smugglers, it's the people who sell car parts and the mechanics who are making a lot of money off of this new vibrant industry. So if you're the government of Niger, why in the world would you stop this if you're just a transit country? Just because Europeans are panicking about Africans showing up? And what happens in these contexts, and this is why the policies can be so difficult, is Europe has really no choice but to come to these governments and say, how much is it worth it to you? How much is it worth to you to be our border guards? And this is what happened in Turkey. When that route exploded, Europe freaked out, and in many ways for good reason. There was just anyone and everyone was coming over. And so the European Union approached the Turkish government, said, is €3 billion enough? And the Turkish government said, we'll consider it. And they said, well, what about €3 billion and visa-free travel for Turkish citizens to Europe? And of course, within the context of EU and Turkish migrations, there's always the future possibility of Turkish membership within the EU. The Turkish government, President Erdogan, kind of patiently waited and waited and waited, and then within a few months, EU said, okay, how about 6 billion? And Turkey said yes, right? But the policy flaw here, of course, is Europe is trying to outsource this issue of border management and to another country, to a transit country. And of course, what happens when Turkey decides that 6 billion isn't enough? Boats might start arriving again. And this doesn't happen within a vacuum. We're in a very complex political situation right now between the EU and Turkey regarding counterterrorism, regarding the Kurds, regarding Iraq policy, regarding Syria policy. There's a lot going on. And so now suddenly Syrian refugees and asylum seekers from other parts of the world are a bargaining chip that gets used within this. And that's what happens in Niger, and it's happened in some other contexts where when you politicize irregular migration in such a way, refugees and, I guess, for lack of a better way to put it, legitimate asylum seekers get caught in this fray and get stuck in these bottlenecks.
I just read the book, I'm deep in it. I apologize, I think I sped through a number of points, but maybe we should back up just a little. Maybe you can tell us what the range of motivations for migrating is on an individual level. People you've encountered, what do you have here, from one end to the other and in between? What are the common stories?
Sure,
because you've met so many people. This is really like a project of human experience that you've been getting this story from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the book doesn't follow specific migrants through the entire journey, but it does reference a lot of migrants to tell very small, specific stories to make the broader points about migrant smuggling. And I think for asylum seekers, for Syrians especially, the stories are so cut and dry. It's obvious why these people are fleeing the war. And it's obvious in many ways why they're then taking matters in their own hands to try to make it to Europe. They have access to resources, like I said, but also information, and also within that region, there are other wars have taken place, other mass displacements have taken place, and I think there has been a lesson learned from the ways in which Iraqis have struggled to find a place outside Iraq where they'll be accepted, where Palestinians have struggled to find a place outside of Israel-Palestine where they'll be accepted. And the Syrians said, well, screw that. Those who had the means said, we're going to Europe, and knew they'd be granted asylum. For migrants from countries that it's not necessarily a fait accompli that they'll be granted asylum, the stories are much more nuanced. There are people who they have tremendous pressure from home to go, where it's been a family investment, where in some cases an entire village has pooled resources to send this young man or this group of 4 or 5 young men to try to make it to Europe and then send money back. There are other examples of people who fall into this real gray area. There was a large wave of migrants and asylum seekers from Afghanistan. Now, at least in the American imagination, Afghanistan is not really considered a stable, thriving place. But many of these kids were coming from places where they said, I have no opportunity, my country is not safe. Except when they arrived, some of the European governments said, actually, the part of Afghanistan you're from, it is safe, and we're sending you back. You're not an asylum seeker. So what drives people to migrate I think is a very nuanced and complicated question that goes down to the individual, which from a policy perspective can make it very tricky to then address the drivers of migration. Many of the people on the move are actually not, especially economic migrants, are not the poorest of the poor. They're people who have some education, some skills, the economic resources to make this investment to try to move. And the reason they're moving is aspirations. Right. They've worked hard, they've attained a certain level of maybe education or professional expertise, and having attained that, they're not seeing the opportunities they would like. I mean, I can think of a lot of high school graduates from Burkina Faso who wanted to work in computer science, and they were like, there aren't any opportunities to do that here, so I'm going to try to go to Europe and do it.
You raised an interesting point there. Can you say a little bit more about how Europe has come up now with a trust fund for Africa in response in 2014, I believe, a lot of money to address root causes.
Right.
Which is a good impulse, instead of just policing borders, trying to invest in development. You had your research actually showed us, and apparently other research before yours also showed this, where when economies rise, it has an effect on migration, but what is the effect?
Yeah, well, that is kind of in the case of the European Trust Fund, $2.9 billion question is that, Europe understands that the refugee crisis means that people are going to move towards Europe. But when you talk to European policymakers, they're not actually that concerned about Syrians or people who are fleeing war, because at the end of the day, there's an assumption, God willing, that these wars will end. And when these wars end, the refugees won't be coming anymore. When it comes to economic migrants, the bulk of whom at this moment are coming from West Africa and aren't necessarily fleeing war or conflict, that's what they're really concerned about. And so they've launched this $2.9 billion trust fund for Europe. That is, trust fund for Africa. Yeah, and they also have,
which is also a trust fund for Europe. Though.
In some ways,
it's
right?
Supposed to help Europe.
and they have billed this as the Germans often refer to it as a Marshall Plan for Africa. So the idea here is that, if people are leaving Africa for Europe, let's make Africa a place that they don't want to leave. And there's some, of course, obvious logic to that. The issue with this assumption is that pretty much all of the economic and academic studies have shown that as many of these countries and communities move from low income to middle income, net migration increases. Because people want to move. People have new opportunities, new aspirations.
And they can afford.
And they can afford to go.
Pay a smuggler to take them to Europe.
Exactly. So, at least in the medium term, the EU Trust Fund for Africa as a development approach is actually working against the European goal of stemming migration.
You had this example of a cashew factory. Where was that? Do you remember? Maybe not. There are probably a lot.
And
you talked to a man who had been working at this cashew factory.
That's not in the book. That's in the foreign policy piece. Okay. And it wasn't. There was a colleague of mine who reported that. Oh, okay. But it is a really good example. Ty. He went to rural Mali and spoke with. So as part of one of this program, I think it was Spain in this case the Spanish Development Agency was implementing. Building this cashew nut processing plant and factory in rural Mali, hoping that this place where a lot of people are migrating from would no longer feel compelled to migrate if they had jobs. And of course, Ty, the reporter, talked to people who said, I love the fact that I have this job opportunity because as soon as I can save enough money, I can use it to get to Europe. So that is one reason why the EU Trust Fund is at least not a short-term solution in any way. The other, there are some other obvious critiques. One pouring money into development aid is not new. So if it were that easy, if it were just a matter of putting the resources towards it, a lot of these issues would have been solved by now. And then the third issue is, and again, it's really recalibrating your entire partnerships with some of these African countries under the guise of preventing greater integration between communities, preventing your people from coming here is politicizing migration and economic trade in a way that is probably not all that useful in the long term. And my concern, besides the kind of blackmail that I outlined before, in which countries like Turkey or Niger, or I mean, for me, without going into it, the most flagrant case is the way in which the European Union and individual European countries are engaging the government of Sudan to stem migration through Sudan, is that it politicizes, again, it makes aid conditional upon, it makes aid and humanitarian assistance conditional upon these governments being willing to do Europe's bidding.
Well, and when you say government in relation to Sudan, this is also
problematic
yeah. term, because as you've outlined, what that money from Europe seems to be doing is empowering local militias, which doesn't contribute to Sudan's stability.
Right.
And in fact, directly undermines it, because a lot of those local militias are also stealing Sudan's oil and illegally.
Well, that's more Libya.
That's more. Sorry, I have Sudan and Libya.
It's okay.
It's hard. There's so many countries.
The Sudan version is problematic too, in similar ways. Yeah.
Yeah, precisely. So we've taken quite a bit of time. I feel like we've hardly scratched the surface.
Sure.
But I want to open it up to questions. But right before, I just want to maybe if you could summarize what your concluding thoughts were at this stage, and having conducted a deep investigation from many different countries. I mean, how many countries were you in for this?
Oh, I'm not sure.
Like all of
a few
those.
dozen. Yeah, not dozen. Not a few dozen, but over a dozen.
What did you feel, if you could summarize for us what you feel like at the time of writing the book, and if it's changed also now,
Mm-hmm.
like, are there any ways forward? What's your recommendation?
Yeah, I mean, this is...
How should we think about this crisis?
Yeah, sure. I'll kind of reiterate what I said at the beginning, that in terms of the migration crisis, in terms of the numbers of people arriving in Europe, in terms of raw numbers, if European countries are willing to work together and pool resources and share the burden of accepting these people or receiving these people, determining who is a refugee and has a right to be here, and then paying for deportation, which is quite expensive. Europe spends about $12 billion a year sending people back. That's actually not a problem that's that hard to overcome if European countries are willing to get on the same page and work together on this. I've said to kind of anyone who will listen over in Europe that there's this rush to do something now. And the conversation happens pretty much the same every time, in which I say I kind of lay out why I think some of these policies are problematic and even counterproductive. And then during the coffee break, someone pulls me aside and says, look, we know this is terrible. We know what we're doing is not going to work in the long term, and that we're kind of betraying all these human rights obligations that we've signed up to and purport to value. But if we don't do something now that at least stems the flow, even in the short term, we're going to lose every election, and the people who will be in charge instead of us are going to be much worse, both for migrants and refugees, but also just for our countries in general.
And that's, of course, referring to, resurgent nationalism in so many European countries.
Right. Exactly. And that's a compelling argument as far as it goes, but it can be used to justify just about anything you want to do. And it can always be used to justify not upholding the human rights conventions and that you've signed up to. But I do think that there's another issue inside of that is there's actually not that much wrong with not having a policy. And this is, I think, something I mentioned to you that I've said actually not having a policy is better than bad policy. And so I'm almost advocating in some ways a sort of strategic patience, because every time Europe has tried to do something in this regard, it's kind of had all of these negative consequences, both foreseen and unforeseen. The EU-Turkey deal, I think in general, most European governments are saying that's actually working for now, and to the extent that there are negative consequences, we're happy to accept those, and maybe 2 years from now, if it falls apart, they'll reevaluate that. But in the case of Libya, I mean, pretty much everything they're pursuing is not only, I think, making the problem worse, but it is just not really defensible in any tangible way, to the extent that that's why they won't even admit what they're doing. To
the extent that, like, actually international law, because they're,
right.
You know, I hope someone will ask questions, and if they don't about this, then
I'll
I will. But
Q&A,
I'm interested in the difference between emotional reactions, which tend to motivate moral responses and frame the question of migration as a moral question, an ethical question, and pragmatic solutions, which aim to come up with a solution to a humanitarian crisis. It is a humanitarian crisis that we have, and gross human rights abuses that are happening now. We haven't talked at all about the conditions that a lot of these migrants are living in these camps. But how do you separate a pragmatic approach for humanitarian purposes from an emotional reaction? Doesn't so much of humanitarian response, don't we rely on our emotional reactions to motivate that? Sort of more of a philosophical question.
I think that ties in nicely to the exhibition, where we were talking about this, how so much of the migrant experience in the way, and the refugee experience in the way, I mean, art by its nature is meant to elicit a response, an emotive response, and it's supposed to resonate with you in a certain way, but it's not necessarily the way to create good policy, right? Yeah. It's a way to maybe drive you to action, to move you to do something. And I think the coverage of the refugee crisis, part of the real challenge here is you want to show the human side of this, and that manifests itself in some pretty brutal images, some very moving images, and then, or the opposite image of, a tightly framed shot that makes it seem like you've got millions of people about to invade Europe. So I think images have been used in a way that the goal is either to elicit one response or another, but it doesn't lend itself to clear-headed policy. And that really has manifested itself, I think, in a lot of the ways that European governments are approaching this crisis, is that we're not looking to solve the crisis, we're looking to just do something in the short term that will allow us to stay in power, stay elected. And even, I mean, this is pretty well documented at this point. Even the Italian government, again, we keep referring to the Libya case, the Italian government that is paying militias to basically do its dirty work, they know it won't really hold up that long, but the Ministry of Interior, I mean, it's kind of an open secret that they're really just trying to reduce the numbers until the next election. And then the unsustainability of the policy can kind of... Right.
And I mean, obviously, it's no surprise that governments think, I'll just finish this thought. It's no surprise that governments act for strategic political gain. This is absolutely no surprise. But the problem is that it's creating, seriously, a huge problem in the immediate and long term, in the future. That, like, the smuggling networks that it's empowering, these criminal networks and organizations, the humanitarian abuses, it's entrenching a problem for them, and for everyone. So let's open it to questions.
Just a quick one. Thanks so much for the talk. It was really insightful. I was wondering to what extent the international community and lawmaking addresses or can address, the issue of statelessness and kind of where the receiving and the host countries both don't want to grant citizenship, and then you have a state of exception that happens indefinitely, and are there any ways out of this state of exception, or how do we think about that?
I mean, that's a great question, and obviously very important one when it comes to people who are stuck in these kind of scenarios of indefinite displacement. By law, refugees are supposed to have an avenue towards some sort of permanent residency and even citizenship. What ends up happening is that just keeps on being delayed. There's actually not much that can be done to compel a state to live up to its obligations. And for obvious reasons, again, it's not just Europe that has to deal with domestic political concerns. I mean, the reason none of these Somalis who are stuck in the Dadaab refugee camp now for generations, there's many reasons why that is the case, but one is that the Kenyan government just doesn't want these people to be citizens. It has implications for, well, they'll say security. I'm not sure I buy that, but it has implications for elections. It has implications for who votes for whom and what that means. I think one way to get around this that has been quite effective, to back up for just a second, there's really only three ways that someone who is displaced can kind of no longer be a refugee. One is that the country they're in grants them asylum and allows them to work and live and go to school in that country. That's not really happening very often anymore. The second is that refugees go home. And in the 1990s, that was actually what was happening on a massive scale. After the Cold War, a lot of people who'd been displaced went home. And I think, I'm forgetting who was the UN Special Representative at the time. He called like the 90s the decade of return. That's not happening anymore. And so the third way is third country resettlement. And that is also not happening on a large scale. I think I don't have the numbers for.
And what is third country?
It's basically if you're displaced and you're in another country, a third country allows you to go become a refugee there. So that's when we think of basically any refugee outside of those from Central America who are granted asylum status in the US. When we think of Syrians or Somalis coming over, they're third country resettled. In 2014, I think it was 100,000 people worldwide, out of a global refugee population of 20 million were resettled, and 70% were in the US. So really no one is living up to the obligation there. And actually it's obviously the rhetoric of refugees and asylum seekers in the US has changed quite rapidly since then. And it's almost hard to remember that the US was one of a handful of countries, in addition to Canada, Sweden, Australia, sort of, that had that were living up to some obligation. So I think third country resettlement would, if we could expand that in a massive way, would help alleviate some of that. But politically, there aren't really any countries that are willing to take on that mantle, and again, it costs political capital to do that.
Yeah, we're gonna have an extended question period because we wanted a bulk of the talk to be questions, so everyone will get a chance.
Okay, first of all, thank you both for this extraordinary presentation. My question goes, because I'm working on the field then, I might have reflected also in many things that you have witnessed and lived so far. So first of all, I have two questions that I'm going to try and put them in one because I'm sure everyone's questions. So the EU-Turkey deal, most of the European countries, specifically the Western Europeans, were not accepting a lot of refugees and migrants through their EU relocation process. They're happy about it compared to the Eastern European countries, and specifically Italy and Greece and maybe Cyprus in the western part of them, that they have different financial aspects going on in the Balkan Route that you mentioned, but then fear and closed the borders in, if I'm not mistaken, December of 2015 or January 2016,
right,
which that increased for sure the whole procedure, how smuggling works. So my first question is, I was interviewing also people back in the field, and were you able to identify or to gather more information on the identity of the smugglers? That's the first question, because
Sure.
What you said, a lot of people do not have the capability to work, whether that's due to lack of education or lack of other resources, which comes to the second question, that a lot of European states, especially talking about the EU, they do want to help by funding, whether that's the trust fund or with their own national policies, but at the same time, they have reduced, some countries declined to accept completely, like 20 people per year, which is
Right.
compared to other states in the Middle East. Lebanon has half, maybe more than its population. They're refugees or asylum seekers. So to that concept, what's your opinion or thought?
Sure. To go to that first question with the Eastern European, the Balkan route, I think that was a really instructive time in which you could see the way in which policies affected how migrant smuggling operates, literally on a day-to-day basis. There was basically as I was kind of going along the route, I was regularly kind of mistook as a refugee and didn't really want to disabuse people of that notion. Obviously, when they started speaking to me in Arabic, which I don't speak a word of, that would go away. But then I'd speak to them in broken English, and they'd say like, "Oh, he must be Iranian." So the route, I mean, you're exactly right. So during the summer of 2015 and into the winter and then early 2016, as migrants were arriving in Greece, part of the reason that route became so popular, and there's actually a map, I think it's the third map I had up there, if you don't mind going back, this one right here. Part of the reason why that route exploded is because these countries that are in the blue are part of the Schengen zone, and so if you can make it to one of these countries, you can travel pretty much without any documentation to the next one because it's a free travel regime in Europe. So crossing from Turkey, which is in the white at the bottom right, into Greece, once you've got to Greece, you're kind of cut off from the rest of the Schengen zone. So the Greeks realized, okay, if we're getting all of these people, none of them want to be here, we don't really want them, so we're going to provide free transportation from the Greek islands to the Greek mainland, and then give them a visa that basically says you can travel through Greece, and good luck. See you later. And so everyone was doing this, and they were traveling by public buses. I mean, new companies emerged saying, wow, I'm going to get in the, like bus routes emerged that were basically taking you from Athens to towns in the middle of nowhere right on the border, saying this is where you want to go. And so the next country in the chain was Fyrom or Macedonia, depending on your how you want to what you want to call it politically, and then people would then continue on to Serbia until they reach Hungary, at which point they're back in the Schengen zone and can move pretty much unrestricted to the countries that most migrants wanted to reach, which were, well, the vast majority wanted to get to Germany, and I'll touch on why that was the case in a second. But at a certain point, so in this kind of environment, being a migrant smuggler is pretty easy. In fact, it's not always clear if you're smuggling migrants. If you're a bus company that changed your routes based on the premise of moving people through Greece, are you engaged in migrant smuggling? It's not clear. If you're the kind of if you own a farm on the border between Fyrom and Greece, and you are willing to let people stay at your house for a night and then escort them across your farm into the next, are you migrant smuggling? And if you do it in exchange for $10, you certainly are. Right. But I mean, this is not who we think of when we think of migrant smuggling. These are not kingpins, right? And but then the borders started getting hardened, and then the first country to kind of really lay down the law was Hungary. Basically, even though, and this is kind of an interesting case, Hungary, no migrants wanted to go to Hungary. They just want to get through Hungary. But Hungary's government is very right-wing and very
Was that before the Dublin Accord was suspended, or was that after that they built the wall?
It hadn't been suspended. Well, Hungary was already saying we might lay down the law, and thank you for bringing that up. I should mention, Europe has this agreement where if you're an asylum seeker and you enter the EU, you have to claim asylum in the country you first arrive in. Practically speaking, that means Italy, Greece, and Spain always bear the brunt of migrants arriving. But again, Greece said we don't want to have to bear the brunt, and the rest of Europe was leaving them high and dry and not really helping them deal with this migration crisis. And that's called the Dublin Agreement, which basically says, so if I arrive in Spain as an asylum seeker and then take a bus to France and I try to claim asylum in France, France can say, we know you arrived in Spain first, we're sending you back to Spain, go seek asylum in Spain. In the late summer, early fall of 2015, German Chancellor Angela Merkel says, basically, we're going to suspend the Dublin Agreement. If you can get here, we're not going to ask how you got here, what countries you came through, refugees welcome. And so that increased the amount of people who just were willing to suddenly make this trip, to this dangerous trip across the Balkans, paying smugglers to try to get there.
And then Germany had 1 million refugees.
Right. And Hungary basically said, well, we think this is the death of Europe. We're going to be, and they built a fence and weren't letting anyone through. And overnight, suddenly all these people who were taxi drivers helping people get across a border couldn't do it. And organized crime groups said, well, we know how to get around these borders because we're used to smuggling drugs, weapons, trafficking women. So yeah, we can help you get across. So prices went up. These groups became way more sophisticated, and also routes changed. That touches, your second question was regarding?
The second question, well, there were somehow.
Oh, who are the smugglers, the
Yes.
profile?
Oh yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah, that depends heavily on the route. In certain cases, and depending on what barrier you're trying to overcome. So I use a pretty broad term of smuggling. I think a smuggler is really anyone who helps someone overcome a border. And that can be a desert, right? That can be a sea. It can also be a cultural barrier in the sense that certain migrants, based on their physical profile or their religious beliefs or their language, can't safely get through certain areas in certain parts of the world, and so they will need to seek the services of someone who can facilitate moving them in a way that's safe. So in general, it's often people in the local community. I mean, there are different types of migrant smuggling networks. Some are highly integrated, that you're paying kind of the entire sum of the journey. If you're starting in, let's say, Turkey and saying, get me to Germany, you pay one guy and that person has managed to facilitate everything that needs to happen. More commonly, there's a more pay-as-you-go type of scheme where you pay someone to overcome one border, and then once you're there, you find someone else who can help you overcome that border. And I mean, it's almost always a hybrid model of a local who knows who to bribe, where to go, who to grease, and a migrant themselves who speaks the language, maybe has paid a smuggler, maybe is in the process of getting smuggled, and has said, well, before I continue on to Germany, I'm going to work in Athens for a few months helping smugglers because I can translate and I know and I have phone numbers of people who want to come, and that's how I'll make $2,000, and then until I get that, then I'll go.
You pointed out that a lot of refugees upon arrival, they can't get jobs, and so they start working with smugglers as smugglers since they've just made the journey, and even if they get waylaid before Europe in a country, you know, that wasn't the country of choice, then they have to work as smugglers, or they decide to work as smugglers for a minute.
And the other kind of interesting component of that too, and it's not something I've quite touched upon, is the way in which smugglers and migrants are collaborating to make this journey, to help make this a successful journey, is part of what makes this kind of, in many ways, a unique crime, right? The person who's paying for the service is like actively helping the smuggler make it as easy as possible. And this demand for customer service, I mean, smugglers have to compete with each other. And if you want to make a lot of money as a smuggler, you have to have a demonstrated ability to do that. And there's a few ways you can do that. A lot of smugglers operate on referrals. So they advertise, they tell people upon finishing the journey, you know, tell all your friends, give them my number, I'm the guy to work with. But they also offer certain different payment schemes to allow for consumer protection in a way. And this really exploded on the Turkey to Greece route. I mean, there was a town in Izmir you could go to, and the Izmir in Turkey that became kind of a hub for where migrants would go, look for a smuggler, and then the smuggler would move them to the coast where they would launch. And the migrant would find the smuggler, and then the smuggler would say, okay, let's go to this restaurant or this hotel. In the back of the restaurant, there's a guy with a table who is a third-party guarantor who's pretty much operating like a migrant escrow account. So you don't pay the smuggler, you pay this guy. And then this guy gives you a receipt. In some cases, they had barcodes. In other cases, they had like literal QR codes that you take with your phone. and it basically says, okay, you've paid $1,200 to be taken to Greece within the next 2 weeks, and if you're not in Greece in 2 weeks, you can come back with this receipt. I'll scan it, and you get your money back, and the smuggler doesn't get his money, and there's $50 overhead for providing this service. And you would see it as these migrants arrive in Greece. The first thing they would do is take out their phones and hit the QR code and say it's done, or immediately call back. I mean, it wasn't always the QR code. That was the most extreme example, but it was not that.
And you pointed out, too, these financial networks are really interesting and totally unofficial, right? So there are no taxes being paid on any of these, obviously. And this money transfer system,
right?
What's it called?
Hawala.
Hawala, this really fascinating alternate money transfer system.
Right. I mean, from a criminal justice perspective, the follow the money approach just isn't possible, because none of this. I mean, formal bank accounts are being used in some cases, and lots of Western Union and that sort of thing, but a lot of the way money moves and then gets laundered is through Hawala banking, which is it's a parallel type of informal financial transaction that's pretty common in the Middle East, in Africa, also in Asia, where rather than say if you need to move money from Afghanistan to Germany in a pinch, you, rather than send it Western Union, you go to a local vendor who might run a import-export carpet.
Or a Western Union.
Or, yeah.
I mean, that he might have the Western Union.
Oh, yeah, he might have the Western Union, but
sign.
he also does Hawala stuff, exactly. And you say, I want to send money to Frankfurt right now. And he says, it's no problem. Pay me, give me the money, $1,000, okay. What's the name of the guy who you want to send it to? Okay, and then it's literally tell him to go to this place at this time. He calls up his friend who's in Frankfurt, and sometimes it's not that direct. Sometimes he calls his friend who's somewhere else, and it can go through 5 different chains. But at the end of the day, within minutes sometimes, that person in Frankfurt is handing money over for a cut that's way less expensive than Western Union. It's completely untraceable, and then maybe the next time these two people do business, they'll remember, oh yeah, you owe me $1,000, so the next invoice that's $12,000, only send me $11,000 and we'll call it even. And a shocking amount of money around the world moves through these informal financial networks, which in some ways, I mean, it often gets a bad rap because it's often said it's how terrorism gets financed, it's how drug money gets moved. And that's almost certainly true, but it's also, I mean, that's a drop in the bucket. It's the way in which a lot of people who don't have access to formal financial institutions that often charge way more and
even
are
for illicit transactions.
Yeah, and are way less efficient, move money. And I mean, I've used Hawala networks in a pinch, and I remember it happened instantaneously. There's no ATMs here. I have no way of getting money. I need to get money. I go up to the guy saying, is there any way I can take out some sort of loan? And he says, yeah, can your friend back in this city bring money to this guy, and then as soon as the phone call confirms that the money, and then I've got my money. So.
Wow. Other question? Yeah, Christopher.
So I'm interested in these migration patterns have such a human dimension to them, right? They're fundamentally very, very human, very personal stories. But from your reporting, what did you see as far as the weaponization of human flows and people flows as a kind of form of asymmetric warfare, right? Sending these people, it's not about sending literal terrorists into Europe, it's about creating anxiety through displacement, changing of demographics, and fundamentally, possibly an undermining of Western democratic ideals and systems.
Right.
And it's Castro sending people to Miami, most of them criminals. It's been repeated in the past, and kind of looking forward on the Korean Peninsula right now, looking at what that migration outflow might look like if something happened. And kind of whether your reporting saw any of that, or has that been completely distorted in terms of that dimension of this problem?
Sure. I mean, I didn't see any of that personally. Maybe that's just the nature of the reporting process of directly, engaging with people on a one-on-one level, that it's hard to suss out if this is a bad guy or a bad apple or someone who is going to Europe to do something kind of nefarious. So I didn't really witness any of that personally. In terms of the extent to which armed groups are using it as a way to infiltrate Europe, or there's often narratives about how this is like a long-term kind of invasion. Society is playing a long game to try to fundamentally change Europe demographically and the way it operates. I haven't seen much evidence of that. I haven't really seen any evidence of that. I guess as a counterfactual, it's quite hard to disprove because you're assuming there's these underlying motives, and I can't necessarily look into these people's hearts and say, I can't take you at your word that the reason you're moving is economic or desperation. But the narrative of that is quite powerful because, I mean, it's certainly gained very valuable currency in Europe and in the US, right? We need to shut down accepting refugees until we can figure out what's going on, is was the Trump quote. And of course, what does that mean? Until we can figure out what the heck is going on. I think I don't know. I don't think it's new that there are concerns and apprehension about mass flows of people from other places coming in. This is not new to this period, and it's not really new to how migration has worked historically and in other contexts. I think what is in some ways new is that there is everyone knows that being granting asylum is a complete losing it everywhere in the West right now. It's a losing issue. It's not something people who support want to run on. It is asking for losing votes, and if and when an attack does happen by someone who came irregularly or as an asylum seeker, then you in some ways have to own that attack, and that's not something anyone wants to do. I think and because of that, that's one of the things that's getting in the way of coming up with for lack of a better way, solution or a coherent policy, because at least for economic migrants, one way to really address this issue structurally would be European nations do want low-skilled labor from certain places, would be to actually provide legal avenues for tens of thousands of sub-Saharan African migrants to come to Europe and work legally, maybe seasonal migration to be there, and then they would have an assurance that when they go home, they can still come back and work the next season. In exchange for that, then telling the source countries and transit countries, look, we're providing all these legal avenues for your citizens to come here and make money, and they're sending money back, and it's mutually beneficial. Mm-hmm. So when people come here irregularly or illegally, you have to take them back, because that's part of this equation, is that the source countries don't have a huge incentive to help Europe send people back.
And they have to help because to deport someone, you need the confirmation of documents that they're actually a national of the country you're trying to send them back to.
Right.
And the country has to provide that, and if they don't want them back, then they don't.
Right. And that would be one way to. It wouldn't solve the crisis, but it would alleviate some of the pressure, and it would accelerate development in these source countries. The reason that is a complete non-starter is because who in Europe right now that wants to stay in office is going to say, we need to accept 50, I am running on the platform of 50,000 sub-Saharan Africans, mostly Muslim, coming here to work in our cities. I mean, that's a complete non-starter. And that's where these emotional responses and both very, but that's kind of where the open borders people get it wrong and the close all the borders people get it wrong. That's kind of the only space in which this can operate, and there actually is something in the middle, but it's politically infeasible.
But then ironically, that is where the weapons come in then, because when you don't have any legal routes, and then the smuggling networks get stronger, and in Libya, as you described in your recent series, it's heavily weaponized, the smuggling trade now. What used to be okay, hop on my ship, I have an extra spot while I'm sending these cargoes of oil. It's now like people at gunpoint, and when you're dealing with since the Syrians' demand has tapered off, and you're dealing with more vulnerable populations, i.e. people who have less money and bargaining power, then there are commodities that are, being loaded at gunpoint sometimes and forced to work off their migration by being slave labor for a year or two in Libya, and then.
I mean, there are parallels here between kind of the war on drugs, in the sense that certain policies have exacerbated the problem or made it more violent without actually reducing any of the harm along the way, or actually the number of drugs that come in.
Maybe one final question, and then of course please mingle and ask Peter as many as you like
I'm
afterwards.
around. And the book's for sale.
Yeah, Dad.
Well, having lived in England, Sweden, Belgium, and France, there's the continuing problem with the exception of Germany and possibly one or two of the Nordics, of very high structural unemployment. And that was feeding the anti-immigration sentiment when I was living in these countries, and I have lived there since 2007 and haven't lived in Europe. But that hasn't changed. There's still, France, the country I probably know the best. The numbers are numbers, but the structural unemployment nationally has not dipped below 10, 11, 12% for decades. And among young Muslims, it's 50%.
Right.
Between 40, closer to 50 than 40%. And the right-wing movements across Europe have, of course, exploited this and with great success. But I've often thought that there's this persistent problem of Europe cannot or will not figure out how to integrate these people into their economy. Even if they let them in, of course now as you've been talking, there's resistance to that increasingly, but the people who come in, there are third, fourth, fifth generation Algerians in France, but they have no future. They have no economic participation in France. And it seems that can only fuel the xenophobia. And of course, France and Germany have very large Muslim minorities. I don't know, Germany maybe 50, 60% of the population now. France is around 12 to 13% of the population, the last I knew.
Mm-hmm. Well, these economic and demographic anxieties are a huge part of the reason why a more coherent approach to managing mixed migration flows, I guess, is what the technical term for it. So flows of irregular migrants and asylum seekers is not really possible, or is not happening. I think a huge part of this, and again, it's failure to economic migrants, and that would be more manageable if it weren't happening at the same time that you're taking in 1 million Syrians. And there's a reason why people are saying enough is enough. And maybe one of the lessons here going forward is everyone should be putting more money towards ending these scenarios of protracted, indefinite, generational displacement. Because then, less people would be coming. I mean, if it were only economic migrants on the move and not refugees, if you could just, we know what it takes to make it so that people are no longer refugees, but it's politically hard and it's expensive. But if we're willing to devote the resources, then we don't have a refugee crisis. Then we only have a very tricky political situation in which you're trying to deal with economic migrants. That doesn't solve the structural issues you just talked about, but I do think that's a key part of maybe preventing this from happening again. And that's really what I find a bit alarming about some of the approaches that various European countries are taking, is that, okay, it might be effective at it might be a stopgap measure that helps stop this one migration flow, but it does nothing to the same problems will arise again the next crisis around. So there's not actually any problem solving in terms of creating infrastructure or creating a mechanism towards dealing with these crises. It's tailored to this specific flow. And the last part I would add to that is that part of the reason why certain countries have to bear such a brunt is because the benefits they offer or the opportunities they offer to asylum seekers and migrants are so drastically different. And that's part of the reason why everyone wanted to get to Germany or Sweden. So there's completely different policies in terms of monthly allowances you get, rights to work, rights to education, family reunification. I think only Germany and Sweden offer family reunification. So there's obviously a huge incentive to get to Germany. And if Europe would be willing to burden share so that these people who say, well, I don't want to go to Hungary because they don't offer nearly as much and there's not as much opportunity as there is in Germany. I mean, one way richer European nations could subsidize that and help get on board so that Europe as a cohesive unit is addressing this crisis and pooling all of its diplomatic capital, economic capital to address it. But again, right now, the climate in Europe is not one of burden sharing.
And one thing the book really made me think about, because obviously, yeah, each of these countries have their own problems, but really like taking a long, hard look at the fact that Europe's failure at integration in the past cannot be the reason for not accepting refugees in the present, because they're going to come anyway. So there's just got to be a more pragmatic, even though we have huge unemployment nationally, you still have to come up with job programs. You just have to do it. You have to keep trying to be better at integration.
Right. I mean, well, yeah.
And letting people come legally.
And yeah, and for me, I mean, you either believe in the Refugee Convention or you don't. That to me, I often kind of cringe when we see these studies out that, oh, refugees are a net economic benefit. And this is something that was making the rounds in the US recently. You see refugees in the US are contributing to society and are disproportionately entrepreneurs and educated, and that's great. If that changes minds, attitudes, that's great, but it's also, the question is, so what?
It's also not really, it's not elective, it's not the point.
Right, whether or not you should be granted asylum or refugee status should not be predicated on what you can contribute to society. That's not
in
how
our
refugee
current
works.
International law.
Right.
This is not an opinion, this is how it's set up internationally right now, as it pertains to refugees. Peter, thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was fascinating. Thank you for all your questions.